During my mother's funeral, a heavy tension filled the air when my mother-in-law arrived, wearing an unexpected smile. As she casually walked through the house, she mentioned that my home would soon belong to her son. She then began eyeing the rooms, wondering aloud, "I wonder if this room would be suitable for me." I politely corrected her, explaining that I was the one inheriting the house. Undeterred, she argued that since I was married to her son, everything I owned was technically his as well. "So, this house is really my son's, right?" she said with a grin. Her lack of sensitivity toward my grief was jarring, and with an unsettling cheer, she suggested we should start getting along better, implying that she would soon move in. I could feel my frustration rising. Why bring this up now? Can't you see this is not the time? The thought echoed in my mind as I looked at the house, my parents' home, filled with memories, and felt it being threatened by her unfounded claim. Reflecting on my own journey, I was reminded of the path that led me to this point. At 44, I had almost given up on marriage after turning 41, but life surprised me when I met Brian, my now husband, 5 years younger than me. We met through a mutual friend, and he has always respected my opinions, even when it came to our honeymoon destination. While he initially suggested Europe, he readily agreed when I chose the Maldives instead. However, complications arose when he mentioned that his mother was considering living with us due to his father's declining health. Though I sympathized with her situation, we had made it clear before marriage that we wouldn't be living together. I reminded him of this, and he promised to have a conversation with her. As time went on, I realized that I needed to stand firm and protect my family home from becoming just another possession to be claimed by my mother-in-law. My husband, understanding my concerns, promised to support me in ensuring our home remained a sanctuary, undisturbed by unwanted intrusions. The joy of meeting someone wonderful, like Brian, was always bittersweet for me. My father had passed away 4 years before my wedding, never having the chance to see me married or offer his reassurance about my future. He had been a disciplined and dedicated executive at a small company, someone I deeply admired for providing for our family despite our modest means. As I began my own career, I understood more than ever the sacrifices he had made. 3 years after our wedding, my mother also passed away. Throughout this painful time, Brian stood by my side, offering his support and kindness. "Are you okay? Maybe you should rest for a while," he'd say, always mindful of my well-being. The funeral was held at our family home, far from the impersonal funeral homes that have become common. It was a personal touch that brought some comfort. I was grateful for Brian's understanding as I navigated the heartache. However, the atmosphere shifted when Sandra, my mother-in-law, arrived. She expressed her condolences, which I thanked her for, though our relationship had always been cordial but distant. Her demeanor, however, was oddly cheerful, and I soon realized it felt out of place. She thanked me for organizing the funeral, claiming it went smoothly thanks to my efforts. Then, to my surprise, she abruptly said, "The funeral's over now, isn't it? Let's move past the formalities." I was caught off guard, initially thinking her kindness had been genuine, but as she wandered through the house, commenting on how beautiful it was, I felt uneasy. When I mentioned some rooms were untidy, she waved it off, saying, "Don't worry about the details," before casually stating, "My son will inherit this house, maybe I should take this room." I hesitated, trying to grasp the full weight of her words, but it quickly became clear, her earlier pleasantries had been a thin veil for her true intentions. She was now openly laying claim to my family home. I reminded her that I was the one inheriting the property, to which she responded with a smirk, "I know your parents had no other children, and as a wife, everything you have belongs to your husband, so, this house must really belong to my son, right?" Her words left me exasperated as I questioned the legitimacy of her claim. She then cheerfully suggested, "We should get along better from now on," as if her intrusion was already a done deal. Alarmed, I asked, "Does this mean we'll be living together?" Without missing a beat, she replied, "Exactly, with such a lovely house, it would be a waste to leave rooms empty when 2 people could live here. Plus, I won't have to care for my husband alone anymore." Her insensitive remarks, made so soon after my mother's passing, only fueled my frustration. I couldn't believe she was making such demands during such a sensitive moment. At that moment, my husband overheard the exchange. He stepped in, visibly upset. "Mom, what are you saying? This is not the time for this conversation," he scolded her. Undeterred, she responded, "Why make such a big deal out of it?" My husband, firm but calm, insisted she leave and escorted her out. apologizing to me afterward. "Sorry, Mom can be unreasonable," he said. I appreciated his support, replying, "It's okay, thanks for handling it." As the funeral began to fade into the past and we discussed the future of my family home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was facing an ongoing battle to protect the memories and legacy of my parents from being overshadowed by my mother-in-law's claims. 12 days after the funeral, I noticed a subtle shift in my husband's behavior. We were talking about the possibility of moving out of our cramped apartment when I suggested, "This apartment is getting too small. Shouldn't we think about moving into my parents' house?" He agreed, "You're right. With the possibility of having kids and needing more space, it's better than staying here." But then he hesitated before adding, "We should start preparing for the move." As we discussed the details of moving, he brought up something unexpected. Considering the large, empty house, I wondered if maybe my parents could move in with us. But then, to my shock, he said, "Maybe we should think about living together with my parents." I was stunned. "Are you suggesting we live together?" I asked, struggling to understand where this was coming from. I'd noticed a shift in my husband lately, though he had always been considerate of my opinions. Now I wondered if he was simply agreeing with me without truly considering the consequences, or if he had begun to side more with his mother. His willingness to entertain her wishes was becoming too apparent. His suggestion about living together made me question his commitment to our shared values. Despite my clear objections to cohabitation, he seemed to waver, too often aligning with his mother's desires. I reminded him, "Haven't we talked about this? We agreed we wouldn't live together." His usual response was, "But Mom keeps insisting." I brought up how he had stood up to her at the funeral, telling her she was out of line. "You stood up to her then, didn't you?" I asked. He responded, "Yes, but that doesn't mean I'm completely opposed to the idea of living together. I just didn't think we should make such a big decision in the heat of the moment." At the funeral, he had seemed to support me, but now it felt like he was backing off from that stance. His reluctance to take a firm position left me frustrated. It felt like he was trying to stay neutral, unwilling to choose between me and his mother. I was clear about my boundaries, would not live with someone who had intruded into my parents' house during the funeral, claiming a room like she was entitled to it. "Please, make sure your mother understands that," I insisted. Reluctantly, he replied, "Why does this bother you so much?" "Fine, I'll talk to her." My feelings about living with my in-laws had changed drastically since the funeral. The thought of sharing the house that my father had built, one filled with memories of my parents, with my mother-in-law felt unthinkable. And even more troubling was my husband's lack of conviction when it came to asserting my stance on cohabitation. A few days after my mother-in-law had called me heartless for not wanting to live together, I was shocked to see my husband rearranging our living room. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Are we getting ready to store moving boxes?" He replied, "No, I'm making space for 2 beds." My heart sank. "Are your parents coming to stay?" I asked cautiously. "No, they're moving in today," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Despite my objections, it seemed that he and his mother had decided on cohabitation without even consulting me. "Why is this happening?" I asked, my frustration mounting. He explained, "Their lease is up, so we decided they'd move in instead of renewing it. It'll be a little tight with all of us, but we're moving soon anyway, right? Just bear with it." Distressed, I replied, "That's not what I meant. Why is living together even an option? I've said before, I don't want to live with someone who barged into my parents' house on the day of the funeral and tried to claim a room as if it was hers." He promised, "I'll talk to my mom, okay? We'll all be living together from now on, so please try to get along." I couldn't help but ask, "Why do you prioritize everything your mom says?" He tried to reassure me, "It's not about prioritizing her. I listen to both of you and try to make decisions based on that." But it was clear to me that when it came to his mother, he couldn't seem to resist her influence. Despite his assurances, it felt like his decisions were being guided more by her than by what was best for us. I had always seen Brian as kind, but with my mother-in-law around, he seemed to become someone else entirely. I found myself increasingly trapped in a living situation I never wanted, all because of their insistence. We had barely settled into our cramped apartment when my mother-in-law began complaining about the conditions. I apologized for the sudden addition of 2 extra people, assuring them we'd manage until we could find a bigger place. My father-in-law, Frank, was polite enough, but it quickly became clear that he was just as easily swayed by my mother-in-law as anyone else. It wasn't long before she asked me to run an errand for her, to pick up a medicated patch. Though a small request, It added to the growing frustration I felt. With each passing day, as my in-laws prepared to move into my parents' home, the situation became more untenable. The idea of living under one roof with them was suffocating, and I knew I had to do something to protect my parents' legacy from becoming just another part of their claim. My mother-in-law, as usual, was excited about the prospect of the move, eagerly anticipating the space and comfort it would provide. What she didn't know was that I had been making my own preparations to ensure that my childhood home remained mine, untouched by her influence. After 12 days of quiet contemplation, I made a drastic decision. I renounced my inheritance, securing court approval to relinquish my rights to the property. When I announced it to my family, I explained, "This house holds too much sentimental value for me. I couldn't bear to see you living there, so I've decided to let it go, preserving it as a beautiful memory in my heart." My mother-in-law was incredulous. "What kind of madness is this? Even if you didn't want it, you could have sold it for a lot of money. Why just abandon it?" I remained calm as I replied, "Selling it would only mean you'd rely on that money next. It's clearer this way. If I have no claim to it, it's easier for me to move on." She was furious. "We moved out of our old place for this. What are you going to do now? How will you make it up to us?" I stood my ground. "I've always opposed living together. You forced this situation on us without a proper conversation, so I had to make a stand." The look on my husband and mother-in-law's faces was priceless, pale, speechless, and shaken. My father-in-law, bewildered, stood silently by, unsure how to process what had just unfolded. Then I turned to Brian. "I've been thinking about divorce. What do you think?" he stammered, caught off guard. "Divorce?" Before he could continue, my mother-in-law interrupted, her voice sharp. "Brian, you need to divorce this ridiculous wife immediately." Her demand was harsh but predictable, a challenge to see whether my husband would finally stand up for me or remain under her thumb. Brian mumbled something, still struggling to find the right words. Seeing his hesitation, my resolve grew stronger. "Fine, if divorce is the only way, then let's proceed with it," my father-in-law chimed in, attempting to intervene. "Brian, it can't be helped. Your mom insists." Brian, looking defeated, finally spoke up. "Well, you seem to want a divorce too, and maybe that's for the best." Even in this crucial moment, it was clear that both he and his father remained unable to challenge my mother-in-law's dominant will. They were both too quick to default to her wishes, even on such a life-altering decision. Resigned but resolute, I said, "Very well, we'll proceed with the divorce." I planned to move out with just a few essentials. That night, I stayed in a budget hotel, knowing I had tasks ahead. The following day, I took a half-day off work and returned to the courthouse to finalize the paperwork. A few days later, my mother-in-law called, clearly agitated. "What's going on? It looks like the house is now going to be yours. Why the sudden change?" Her voice was sharp, no doubt having learned of my decision through the estate process. "Yes, the house is mine now," I confirmed, my voice steady. She flew off the handle, accusing me of forgery. "You forged documents to deceive us." I remained calm. "Why would I forge documents meant for court submission? Those are legitimate." "Then why is the house becoming yours when you were supposed to renounce the inheritance?" she demanded. I replied, "Well, after submitting the renunciation application, I withdrew it. Renouncing an inheritance is difficult once accepted, but it takes about a month for the application to be processed. During that time, it can still be retracted." From the moment I submitted the renunciation application, I carefully orchestrated the situation to gauge reactions and plan my next move. I never intended for my mother-in-law's mindset to change, but I hoped that my husband might show some reluctance toward the divorce. If he had expressed any hesitation, I would have reconsidered and clarified the situation regarding the house. However, things had taken a different turn. "So, the property division will make the house yours then, since it was acquired before the divorce. It's supposed to be split, right? You two are supposed to sell it and divide the money, aren't you?" my mother-in-law reasoned, trying to salvage something from the situation. I had anticipated this. If the house had been jointly acquired, it would indeed be subject to division, but it wasn't. It was an inherited property, which is exempt from property division. Specific assets, like inherited property, aren't subject to division, I clarified. She pressed on. "What about the money that would come to Brian through property division?" "We've only been married for a few years," I responded calmly. "The shorter the marriage, the less likely the division of individual inherited assets. This complicates her plans," I firmly stated. I'm protecting this house because it holds precious memories of my parents. I don't want people like you living there. If you have any further complaints, please consult a lawyer." After that heated exchange, the divorce process accelerated more quickly than expected. It seemed my mother-in-law had urged my husband to expedite it, regardless of her reasons. The divorce was finalized, freeing me from the ongoing stress of dealing with my in-laws. A sense of profound relief washed over me, as though I had successfully shielded my father's home from any disruption. After I moved out, my ex-in-laws, who had already been living in cramped conditions, must have felt even more confined with one less person. My former mother-in-law began searching for new accommodations, but given their age, passing rental screenings proved to be a challenge. Eventually, my ex-husband found a smaller, single-family home for them. Although it was a downgrade in size and likely came with higher rent, it provided them with their own space. He took on the responsibility of supporting his parents, facing a difficult road ahead. What had initially thrilled my former mother-in-law, the idea of moving into my father's large house, now seemed a distant dream. Instead, she had to settle for a much smaller, humbler reality, which must have been a disappointing turn of events for her. As for me, I began a new chapter in the home my parents had left behind. The house felt warm and comforting, almost as though they were still with me. It was a place where I could honor their memory and preserve the legacy they'd built. This new beginning was a time of healing, reflection, and peace, a chance to truly make their beloved home my own.